This is, we're going to deal with transportation today, and we were blessed to have Jennifer Mitchell here with us today. So I'm going to introduce Jennifer to you and turn the floor over to her. And after she makes her presentation, we'll have time for questions and answers, and we'll talk about transportation in general and where we think we're going or what we know about it as far as where we're going. Jennifer Mitchell was appointed by Governor Terry McAuliffe as the Director of Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation in January of 2014. The Commonwealth agency responsible for providing multimodal transportation solutions to Virginia by providing over $700 million in annual investments to 44 public transit providers, 6 daily Amtrak intercity passenger trains, and freight railroads for capacity enhancements. She has over 20 years of experience in transportation industry. She don't look old enough for that, does she?
That's a little old.
She is specialized in planning and implementation of public transit projects with a particular emphasis on developing financial plans and advancing projects. That's why she's going to be important to be here today. Prior to joining DRPT, she was Assistant Vice President with Parsons Brinker Hall, a transportation consulting firm, where she advised transportation agencies across the country on funding strategies, capital program management, and project development. She served as Deputy Project Director for the Dulles Corridor Metro Rail Project at the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority and held several working positions on the Dulles project throughout its environment and planning phases. Jennifer also held other consultant positions in which she worked on public transit, highway, airport, port projects across the U.S. and internationally. Jennifer has a master's in regional planning from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a bachelor of urban planning from the University of Virginia. She's a member of the executive committee for the APTA. I have no idea what that is. Board of Directors. Chair of the Public Transportation Foundation and a member of APTA's Policy and Planning for Legislative Committee. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Jennifer.
Thank you. Make sure we give you a shorter bio.
You just do too much.
Yeah, so thank you. I wanted to come and speak today about a few different topics related to transportation funding. I first wanted to start off, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the transit funding issues, and I'll apologize to those of you that may have been in the Transportation Committee meeting yesterday. This may be a little bit redundant for you, but I think hopefully some additional information that we may not have. And I was also asked to provide some additional information about smart scale funding and where we are with some of the changes in the program. And so I'll go through that at a very high level. I'll caution you all, though, I may not be the expert in smart scale funding, so if you have detailed questions, then I'll have to get back to you on that. But let me start off first by, oops, there we go. Not sure what I did here.
Okay, Dave.
All right. That part of the screen. All right, so just push this side button. Ah, there we go. Yes. Okay, first, as Wayne mentioned in the bio, so DRPT, for those of you that may not be aware, we're actually not part of VDOT. We're separate from VDOT. We're the Department of Rail and Public Transportation. We do oversee all transit funding in the state. We don't operate any transit, but we provide funding. We do planning work. We provide oversight, main liaison with the federal government, and we distribute federal funds to transit systems across the state too. And we do also oversee passenger rail and freight rail programs too. I wasn't going to talk about that in my presentation, but if any of you have questions about that afterwards, we'd be happy to talk about rail as well. So transit has a significant economic benefit to the state. We've done a lot of work over the past couple of years to estimate what that impact is. And just in terms of direct productivity benefits, the benefit each year is about $150 million to the state. Transit agencies also spend a lot on capital needs, which I should note a lot of that actually is spent on manufacturers and equipment and construction firms that are all located here in the Commonwealth as well. So over $630 million a year. Recently, the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission also did a study which estimated that the benefits of transit to the Commonwealth, and just in terms of additional tax revenue that's generated to the state, is about $600 million a year. And that's just for WMATA and VRE, so the two larger transit systems up in Northern Virginia. The reason that is significant is because, again, it's that there's, I know, a lot of questions about the value that transit creates at the local level, but we also wanted to understand what that value is that's created to the state and really to the statewide coffers in Richmond. I think that $600 million, as Jeff McKay said yesterday, is about equal to the state's law enforcement and I think higher education budgets as well. So if that gives you a sense of the scale of the economic impact of Metro and VRE, it's pretty significant. So we have a funding issue coming up in the next couple of years where we are going to lose about 40%, over 40% of our statewide transit capital funding. And that's due to the expiration of some bonds that have been used by the state since 2009, used for a variety of different purposes in transportation, but in addition to other high priority projects, we've also been using them to essentially prop up our capital program at the state. So we were, as we worked with the General Assembly through this issue and tried to figure out how we could approach it, they put together a group called the Transit Capital Project Revenue Advisory Board. And it was a group that was put together to look at potential funding strategies to address this, but also to develop a proposed prioritization process that could be used for transit projects as well. And we did provide a report to the General Assembly in August of 2017. I do want to recognize John McLennan here, who's also a member of one of our other advisory boards that had a great deal to do in working with this advisory board too, and looking at both prioritization strategies and funding. So it was a pretty intensive effort that went on for over the course of about a year. So as I mentioned before, the General Assembly had authorized $3 billion in bonds several years ago. These have been getting used for, we've been using about $60 million a year for transit capital in addition to some of the other funds. It also provides $50 million a year in the state's match for federal funds that goes to WMATA. There's a special $150 million a year that the federal government gives to WMATA, and DC, Maryland, and Virginia are each asked or required to put $50 million in it. So that comes out of these bonds too. The important thing is that when these bonds expire, the needs don't go away. They're, if anything, we actually are seeing that the needs are going and increasing over time. And this is a picture of what that looks like. We actually put together, we did a lot of work in working with our grantees across the state, looking at capital programs, state of good repair needs. The majority of our program is a state of good repair, that's SGR, as you can see on this bar chart. What that is, it's primarily replacing vehicles, but it may also be replacing bus stops or track and infrastructure work. It could be new maintenance facilities or rehabbing maintenance facilities. So it's really about taking care of the assets that we already have, and that both the state and the local agencies, such as your counties that fund transit agencies, have already invested in. And really just very modest expansion needs over and above that. And even with this expansion, there's very few large projects in here. It may be a slight expansion of some additional lines or some additional services. But again, mostly state of good repair. I get that question a lot from General Assembly members, especially, who want to know, if you were able to just fund all of your expansion needs on a smart scale, make them compete for funding, would that solve the transit funding issue? And the answer is no. We still would not have enough money to meet that gap. And this is really what the gap looks like over time, starting in, really starting next year, but starting in 2020, we do expect that we'll have less funds available than we need in terms of needs. That is going to continue to increase over time. We've estimated that an annual amount of about $130 million, which is the average of all that, would be sufficient to help address this gap over the next 10 years. Right now, the way the state gives out funding is we basically take all the requests that come in, as long as they're eligible, we make sure they're eligible, we make sure that they're good projects and necessary, and then the money is spread around to all of the agencies based on certain matching rates. So depending on the type of project you have, you may get 68%, we match buses at 68%. 18% is the rate that goes to things like infrastructure, bus stops, and well, I'm sorry, tier 3 is also for other things. So starting in 2019, this is what the tiers would look like, and you can see that those will go down over time. So what this means is that by 2021, we're not going to have any money to fund anything but buses if we continue to fund things in the way that we do right now. So, and in this case, we would really only be able to fund at a match rate of 49%. So right now, transit agencies may, with the funding that they use from their county and local governments that sponsor, that fund them, will pay 34% for a bus, but in the future it'll go up to 51%. And then as you can see, their match would increase even more in the out years here. So we'll have no funding available for anything else though. So we put together a couple scenarios using some, because I know that these charts do a great job of illustrating what does this actually mean. So we put together a few examples, taking some projects that were in our 6-year plan right now, and looking at what the funding picture would look like if this transit capital cliff had come to pass. And in this case, this is an example from PRTC of some 31 replacement commuter buses that we're funding in 2018, and as you can see, we're funding about 18 million of that today. In the future, after those, we've got 12 million of state funds in there. In the future, that would drop down to less than $5 million. PRTC would have to come up with an additional $7.5 million just to complete that same order. And again, PRTC is funded by Prince William County, Stafford, and a number of the other jurisdictions down in that part of the state, so pretty significant impact for those local governments. This is an example of, in the city of Harrisonburg, just a smaller example, but 2 expansion buses for the system there. Our state match would have dropped from, including the federal funds that we provide, which we would also have to change the way we allocate those. The local match would go up from about $33,000, which is what Harrisonburg puts in today, to about $445,000, so pretty significant impact. And then with Blacksburg, we're actually funding a new or replacement bus administration facility there, using primarily some federal funds and also statewide funds. And in this case, if the tiers were to drop where we can no longer fund anything but vehicles, the town of Blacksburg's match would go up from $4 million to about $32 million, so a net increase of $28 million. So again, these are illustrations are not necessarily to scare people, but to illustrate what the impacts could be on all of the jurisdictions that currently do fund transit systems across the state. If the state funding isn't there, then the local funding is going to have to make up the difference, and we understand there will be a lot of tough choices for people to make as well. So the Revenue Advisory Board, rather than dictating a set of new funding, specific new funding recommendations to the General Assembly, they came up with some funding principles instead. And there's a few components of it, but the first and probably the most significant being that it should be a combination of funding sources. So both to spread the pain, but also to create a stream of funding that can be reliable and withstand economic fluctuations over time. Also, a combination of statewide and regional sources. And this is very important, particularly to Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, where there is, we have regional funding sources available, which have been used for a variety of different projects. But we've really been using the statewide program to support some of these transit needs. And so while it would make sense to generate some funds regionally for transit, there's a strong sense from the advisory board that really recognizing the statewide impact that transit has, that there should continue to be statewide funding that goes to transit as well. We also looked at developing a prioritization approach that allows us to better allocate funds. It recommends a floor on the regional taxes in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, which could potentially be used for transit as well, and then utilizing the statewide, what we call priority transportation funds for transit in the future too. So on top of all this, there's been a lot of developments over the past year with LaHood Metro. And their general manager has come out and said that they need an additional $15.5 billion over the next 10 years. And this is just to address stated good repair and safety needs. And it's primarily to address a very massive backlog of deferred maintenance and deferred capital expenditures over time. And this is something actually that we've studied and believe to be true. And also the operating subsidies the jurisdictions put in every year have been growing at a very alarming rate, to the rate at which the local jurisdictions just can't afford to keep up with the subsidies anymore. And one reason for that is ridership's been falling because the reliability of the system has been very poor, also related to a lot of this deferred maintenance and safety issues. But it's been a very significant financial burden on all of the local governments as well as the state that fund WMATA. So we asked Secretary LaHood, who's a former U.S. Secretary of Transportation, to do a review of WMATA's governance and funding structure and to come back with a objective, unbiased recommendations on what he feels should be done. And actually the report was included, it was shown in the Washington Post over the weekend, and really what he's recommending is a combination of governance changes with a smaller board, but also additional funding to be able to make up that the gap that we have with additional deferred maintenance. What he did find also is that the labor costs for WMATA are very much on par with other peer agencies and also in line with other comparable professions in the Washington, D.C. area. There's a concern from a number of people that perhaps some of the union contract provisions result in much higher operating costs, and he also found that that's not actually the case as well. There are some things that he recommended that need to be changed in order to bring the cost structure more in line, but most importantly, there is a need for some long-term dedicated funding from Virginia, D.C., and Metro. So right now, this is something we're working on. We're coordinating with the local governments up in the D.C. area as well on potential funding strategies, and I expect that Governor McAuliffe has announced already that we will be putting something together and announcing that within the next few weeks on a potential funding proposal. But it will likely need General Assembly action. So the Virginia portion of those needs would be about $160 million a year. And that would be above and beyond the gap that I showed you before of $130 million a year. So we have two separate but related issues that are colliding at the same time on transit funding. And it's going to put the state in a position of trying to figure out, if there is not a General Assembly solution with some new funding sources, the CTB has the option of taking money from Smart Scale. It's really one of the only pots of money available that they can divert to this, or to take the transit capital funding that we have today and put it all towards WMATA so that we can keep WMATA system fully funded, recognizing that we can't just let WMATA stop operating. That's not an option. Or we try to maintain all of the statewide needs and leave the Northern Virginia jurisdictions on their own to figure out WMATA as well. So there's a lot of different scenarios, none of them good, that we're trying to figure out how to address with this. But it is a very important issue to us. I think it's, and Secretary Lane has said many times, this is the most important transportation funding issue going forward in the state that the next administration is going to have to deal with. So now I do want to switch to Smart Scale and talk a little bit about what's been happening at the statewide level. There were a number of changes that the CTB has been considering and VDOT has been considering that were attempting to address some of the things that we saw in the first two rounds of Smart Scale. We received a lot of public comments that pointed out the ways in which some of the measures could be improved, and the two that they were looking at in particular were related to the congestion mitigation, but also at the accessibility measure as well. And there were some recommendations made, but those are not actually going to be advanced based on the last CTB meeting. The schedule, however, is changing, and we are now going to be accepting applications much earlier in the year. So this would really be in August of every 2-year cycle in which we'll be doing Smart Scale. But really, we want the process to begin as early as March, and we're encouraging people to reach out start working with their district offices at VDOT or with DRPT to start looking at potential applications and looking at the type of information that's needed to put those together. The reason for this is just because of the volume in applications, but also the complexity of some of the analysis. And it's important to the Secretary and to VDOT that we be able to have VDOT do the majority of the analytical work that's necessary, so this doesn't become a major burden for the jurisdictions as well. So with an application that's starting in August, that would bring us to an adoption of the CTV in the following spring, and then implementation and funding decisions going out in July through December. So there were a number of changes that were considered related to application limits, eligibility, and readiness. As far as the application limits, at the last CTV meeting, I think the final recommendation, they were looking at actually allowing larger applicants up to 8 projects and smaller applicants up to 4 projects. But the CTV decided at the last meeting to actually bump that up to 10 maximum applications for large applicants. The reason for that is they really want localities to prioritize the projects that are most needed and the ones that were that really have the best potential for being funded at a smart scale. What we saw from a few jurisdictions was people putting in almost their entire capital program and putting in a number of projects. What that also has the effect of doing is, because everybody's being compared to each other, when you have people putting in a lot of projects that don't have necessarily a great shot, or they're not necessarily your jurisdiction's highest priority, it starts to skew some of the results. And so I think there's a sense that in addition to needing more time to do all of the reviews that are needed, it was important to be able to place a cap on jurisdictions in what they're putting in. And on the project eligibility, we get a lot of questions about state of good repair or projects that have elements of state of good repair, and have reconfirmed again that it's very important that these are only expansion projects and projects that are providing new additional capacity over and above what's there today. There's been a lot of questions as well about full funding and whether or not projects have to be fully funded before they're submitted, and the intent is to have projects that are fully funded already in your CIP, but not necessarily to use smart scale funding to replace funding that you were otherwise planning to put in. And a number of other changes here that were all recommended and approved by the CTV. I won't go through every single one of them. On the measures, though, there were a few changes made. One of the things I should say is that we learned a lot through the first 2 rounds of smart scale. I think we saw some unintended consequences, and we were able to learn some more about which measures were working and data sources were working. The safety is one where we recognized that there were, in some cases, presence of DUI-related accidents that were actually skewing the safety-related measure as well. So now that's something that will be pulled out when we're looking at crashes, and we'll be looking at a blended rate of both fatalities and severe injury crashes as well. The congestion mitigation factor was previously based on future year forecasts, so in one sense we were looking at what we should be putting in place to address what could be a bottleneck in the future for person throughput, and what we're looking at now instead is today's traffic volume. So with greater emphasis on being able to solve for congestion mitigation for today's issues. There were a number of changes on the economic development measure, and this was one that I know has received a lot of attention. And I think one of the most important things was wanted to make sure that when a transportation project is being evaluated for its impact on potential properties that have economic development potential, that they actually are moving forward, and that they're projects that are both the zoning is in place for them, but also that they are referenced in all of the local plans as well. So that was a very important change for that. And then also on land use coordination, there was a criteria related before to the degree to which area had economically efficient development patterns. And what they've done instead is change the criteria to accessibility for non-work trips. So it was looking more at the accessibility associated with retail, residential, and other trips that were not necessarily just commuting patterns too. So I know this is a question we received a lot as well about the difference in funding from Smart Scale to what the previous old 40-30-30 measures used to have. And this is a comparison of what FY18 to 23 would have looked like even with the same funding levels, but using the old 40-30-30 distribution as opposed to the Smart Scale and the State of Good Repair measures. And the big reason for that is that there's a lot more discretionary funding that's available now, and we're also funding more projects to completion. And this is really illustrated here too. While there are fewer projects in the 6-year plan, more of them are moving forward. And what we had before was a lot of projects in the plan that had some funding on them, but never enough to actually move them forward and to fully advance them. And so, as you can see, we had a lot of projects in the previous 2 6-year plans, over 1,000 projects that were added, but a number of them not fully funded. We now have fewer projects, but almost all of them are fully funded and moving ahead. And in addition, with the interstate projects as well, we just want to highlight that there's more funding going through in Smart Scale to some of the major interstate projects on 64, I-81, and 95 and 395. But also, you may be following, there's a lot of toll-related projects that are in place right now, particularly Hot Lanes projects in the 95 corridor as well. So when you look at the regional funds, which also include the HR TAC funds and MBTA, toll revenues, and the statewide funds, we're actually seeing quite a bit of funding that has been allocated to the interstate projects across the state. And so right now, we've got about $800 million. Between $800 million and $1 billion that's available every 2 years through Smart Scale. There's been a lot of questions about the long-term viability of the gas tax, both due to vehicle efficiency standards, but also travel patterns over time as well. And I think this is something that the General Assembly will really have to grapple with going forward. And as I mentioned before, we also have a combined issue here with the transit fiscal cliff as well. So, with that, this is just a quick summary of all of the funding, the number of applications as well that's gone forward. We had a lot more applications in round 2 than we had in round 1, about a 38% change in the funding request as well, but actually less funding available than we thought than we had in round 2. So, and that gets back to the limits on the applicants from all of the localities. I know we think the maximum we had from one locality was 33 applications, and that was really, I think, something that prompted the change in the number of applications by locality. As you can see, it was 2.2 going up to 2.8, but I think with this change, we'll start to see that drop down. So with that, I am happy to take any questions that you have.
Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah. Would you mind talking a little bit about the 45-minute versus 60-minute commuter that they use in calculating the commuter's commute? Of course, down in Stafford, Fredericksburg, we feel like that is favors of North and Hampton Roads, places where people commute shorter distances. But I thought I'd like to hear maybe the other side of that, if there is one.
And this may be outside of my area of expertise, but I know that they have changed that limit to try to, or they haven't changed it yet, but to try to recognize that there could be a penalty there. So, yeah. And that really does refer to the longer distance trips that take place in some of the southern jurisdictions outside the DC area. Yeah.
Any other questions? Got off easy.
Yeah, and I apologize if I can't answer the specific questions about Smart Scale, but I'll have to get some too.
I have one.
Okay.
You know, one of the concerns we've heard from rural areas is that the more congested areas could do a better job proving that congestion mitigation is part of their projects. On the other hand, under economic development, we've got the theory that projects receive additional points based on economic disadvantage in the area. Will that help the rural areas compete better against the more urban areas maybe?
I mean, I think that's the intent. I think the changes that were put in place were designed to try to help some of those areas compete on a more level playing field. And I think I know with the economic development factor in particular, that was the one where we saw some of the kind of results that really didn't seem to make a lot of sense intuitively. And so I think those changes hopefully will help rural areas compete more.
Quick question. I'm sorry.
Okay, real quick, actually, it's sort of maybe off topic. We have a lot of new delegates coming in. Is there any thought to reaching out and offering them a briefing or something? I suspect a lot of them don't know a lot about.
Yeah, we are going to be giving them, we are reaching out to them. We're going to be giving them briefings because this is a major issue coming up with the transportation funding landscape. So we will be reaching
That's
out
exactly the answer I wanted to hear. Thank you.
Okay.
Are you familiar with I-73?
Somewhat familiar with it. I'm aware of the proposals for it. Yeah.
I-73 is not in Virginia yet. It's in North Carolina. But our county, Henry County, is basically at the forefront of I-73 in Henry County. I mean, in Virginia. That's where we start at. I just was wondering if you've heard of any fundings or anything to be released in the near future.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any myself. So.
Not either.
Yeah. We're going to about it in our 6-year plan meetings. Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, Jennifer, thank you. Let's give it to presenter. This is this title of this is Navigating the Road Transportation Funding. I don't know how many people were at our committee meeting, the transportation committee meeting the other day, but one of the things that we talked about is just what she's presented today. As you can see, transportation funding is not just your secondary roads or your smart scale or any of these things. It's transit, it's transportation in general. And so I think what you're going to see is us put forward our lobbying effort for transportation funding. The 2313 legislation that was put through has not kept up with the projections that they said it was going to do, which has hurt us a whole lot across the board, not to mention the increased costs, the loss of bonds that she was talking about. So I think this is going to be part of what we're going to have to lobby our legislators for. And one of the other things we're pushing for is to start lobbying the federal government from VACO about the funds. Northern Virginia issues are, without a doubt, as much to do with Washington, D.C. as they are Virginia. So I think we need more participation from Washington if we can get it, which will help free up funds and hopefully the rest of the state. We all, in some form or fashion, are suffering from the congestion that's in Northern Virginia. So it's not just their problem, it's a statewide problem. And so we need to work together to try to see if we can't mitigate some of that. And unfortunately, it requires cash, right, John? Go ahead.
But I think that when I mentioned I-73, I think that's the problem with I-73 being started in Henry County, because a lot of the money that VDOT's got to allocate is going towards the northern part of Virginia and not ending up in the southern part of Virginia. I know it's a smart scale. I don't think smart scale has got anything to do with interstate per se.
I think there's some portion of it.
There are smart scale projects that are on
Just
interstates.
that,
Yeah.
That are,
Yeah.
But
not building the interstate.
No, that's,
I mean, not in these programs, at least, or not in what's in today's program that's being funded by Smart Scale. Not that would, I mean, it would be an eligible use for it, but.
well, what we've seen is the smart scale project, while the proposals and all work good if you've got a specific project. But what's happened is, I know from our standpoint and for any other that are used to secondary road funds, they're about 10% of what they used to be. Okay, so, you know, and these are things that you can take care of: intersections, stoplights, turn lanes, and those type things that wouldn't fit in a smart scale plan. Right. So all of these funding mechanisms, but if we go after those funds individually, if we go to address the legislation and say we need secondary road funds, then we're kind of dividing ourselves into the categories we're interested in. So I think if we take a holistic approach as we go forward, and we'll talk about dividing the money later if we ever get it, but I think that we just need to lobby our legislators in the terms of transportation funding. I think we'll find that that's probably our best bet. So I'm glad to answer any questions if I can, and if not, I guess we'll adjourn this meeting and everybody go to the next one. So, all right.